the starting point is really that when we talk about adaptation, we don't really know what we mean by adaptation in most contexts. In most contexts, adaptation actually means increasing resilience to an unknown change, unknown possible change in the future, or set of changes or fluctuations. Most of the climate change literature uses the term adaptation synonymously with increasing resilience, although conceptually they mean different things. And there has been a sort of in the literature a push towards clarifying that this really means increasing resilience. But then the problem is that resilience really means returning to equilibrium after shock. The capacity to return to equilibrium after shock. In the developing country context, what does equilibrium mean? Is my next sort of point and question. And it seems to me, therefore, that in the context of adaptation/resilience, it's best to think of increasing resilience as one of several policy goals, even environmental policy goals, and therefore really think of it as a multiple concern problem, not as a single objective of suddenly now we have an environmental policy objective which is increasing climate resilience. So that's the third point. And if you have multiple concerns, you also have multiple stressors. Again, we are living in a world where, I mean, all of us, I'm sure, in this room know that the vast majority of the money today coming in for research, for action, for policy discussion is around climate change. And therefore, every environmental problem that we were working on in the last 10 years, whether it was local air pollution and health issues, whether it was flooding, whether it was something else, is now being tagged on to climate change. So as a result now, climate change is the determinant of all debates. And I think there's a certain danger in that, because when you actually look at both the source of the problem, it's not just that resilience to climate change is just one of the concerns, but the source of the problem is also not just climate change. There are many other sources of environmental problems in the developing country context, especially India. And if you want to then try to address some of these issues, you also have to watch out for sort of simplistic models that link climate to outcomes, that skip over some of the steps in between that have to do with infrastructure and institutions. That's sort of the key set of messages that I'm hoping to get across in these few minutes that I have. So the first point, which is, what does adaptation to climate change really mean? Because most of the future climate specifics are unknowable, especially at the scale that we need for action on the ground. Perhaps the exceptions are sea level rise and glacier melt. But with these exceptions, especially the rainfall and temperature and the kind of weather pattern that we would expect, these are not, as Marcus Munch and Steve Tyler have said, it's not about predict and prevent. It's not about a known issue that we can then say, okay, we raise the dike in Netherlands and to adjust for another meter of sea level rise. It's about increasing resilience rather than a known adaptation to a known problem. So it's really increasing our capacity to address problems that we cannot quite know in which direction they will go. So far, so good. But then the question is, as I said, resilience means the ability to bounce back from equilibrium after shock, or to use again the Tyler and Munch language, reducing fragility to the effects of climate change. So they're talking about we are at some point in our level of well-being societally, and now comes climate change, and we are suddenly very vulnerable to moving away from that level of well-being, mostly moving down. So we need to be able to respond quickly and come back to that level of well-being. But the problem is, what does equilibrium mean? This equilibrium to which we want to come back. So this is definitely a concept that has emerged in the West, or this whole thinking that resilience, as in we are in a good shape, and then suddenly you have shocks introduced by climate change or something else, and we need to be able to recover quickly from those shocks. It happened when you have already ample and reliable and clean water supply, high investments in irrigation systems, flood control infrastructure, when you've got ample clean energy supply, and put clean, of course, in quotes, because it doesn't look at the CO2 implications of that, and a fully mechanized, chemicalized, and environmentally controlled agricultural sector with huge subsidies. This is your sort of typical European and North American picture. And in that context, then you introduce this thing called climate change, and suddenly you feel fragile, suddenly you feel vulnerable, and you have to think about resilience, these kinds of shifts. But is that what, does it make sense to talk about equilibrium in a developing country context like India? Look at agriculture. We already have a farmer suicide rate of 29 farmers per lakh per year in Maharashtra. This is the NCRB data. We have pesticide and fertilizer use increasing at increasing rates and increasingly unregulated in terms of its environmental impacts. So if you look at just air pollution, you've got outdoor air pollution accounting for 6 lakh premature deaths per year in India. This is the Global Disease Burden Report, and a larger proportion or larger number comes from indoor air pollution in the Indian context. And now I'm going to use the water sector to give you some more concrete examples from a particular case study. So if you look at the water sector, look at the symptoms that you see out there: drying rivers, dwindling groundwater resources, polluted rivers, pockets of extreme scarcity amidst overall plenty in water supply. And I'm going to use the example of the Atree River Basin. I just hope I can use this correctly. So if you look at this, if you want to see an example of drying rivers, look at this trend of flow in the Eucalyptus River, which is close to Bangalore. From 1940 to the 1980s or late 1970s, we have a steady average sort of with fluctuations with rain, and then after that we have a very steady decline in the flows of the river at the early reservoir point. In 2010, you have actually 1/5 of the design flow for which the dam was built. More importantly, if you look at the pattern of change in the flow, you have basically no base flow after 1992, no post-monsoon flows in the river after 1992. If you look at the shallow aquifer, which is the aquifer till about is a weathered zone of 60 feet or so, essentially it's gone dry. And then if you look at the deep aquifer, which is the tapped by bore wells, you will see the level at which first water was hit when you drilled a bore well was around 150 to 250 feet in the 1970 to 1990 period, and then it starts that median point starts going deeper and deeper. So then in the latest 5 years of borewell drilling, you're hitting water at 700 feet in a median sense. Of course, there's a spread, and this is data from actual farmer surveys of borewells that they have drilled. The more telling point is that 50% of borewells in this particular catchment have been abandoned today drilled over the last 30 years. Today you have 58% which are dry and abandoned. So that's the situation with groundwater, and of course you just need one picture or one whiff of the Shivavati River, where actually I live in Bangalore, to know that it's the sewer of Bangalore. And at the same time, the average water supply to Bangalore, if you calculate simply in LPCD terms, is still averaging at 150 LPCD. If you take the numbers of water lifted from the Kaveri and the groundwater that is pumped out of the aquifer supplied to Bangalore, and at the same time, in the middle of Bangalore, in the heart of Bangalore, actually close to Lal Bagh, those of you have visited Bangalore, you have pockets of extreme scarcity and contamination. So sewer gutters and water supply lines running in the gutter itself, and households operating at really 20 LPCD, 30 LPCD liters per capita per day, as against a notional target of 50, 80, or 130. So that's the status in terms of what we are doing in the water sector. So where we are in the water sector. So my point is that this is not an equilibrium that we may want to bounce back to. So the whole point about resilience is bounce back to an equilibrium, but is this where you want to be after you've had that climate shock? Certainly not. So how do we then think about this issue of climate resilience when we really don't want to be here and we are nowhere near equilibrium? Groundwater is declining, rivers are drying, pollution is increasing, and so on and so forth. So it might be better to start off by acknowledging that we really have multiple normative goals. It's the same co-benefit story, but in the adaptation context, that our goal is obviously enhancing livelihoods and improving the quality of life. For example, trying to meet a goal of 90 liters per capita per day of water supply for all residents of all settlements, not just urban. For example, you have the other normative concern, which is sustainability, which is different from resilience. For example, stabilizing groundwater levels. It's not about resilience, it's about just not allowing the resource to disappear completely so that one fine morning you can't run your pump set at all. Equity and social environmental justice. So, for instance, fair allocation within a city, across cities, across states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, for instance, and across sectors. These are the challenges which we are already facing, and we are really doing a very poor job at addressing some of these challenges. And finally, the normative goal of democratic governance. I think we often tend to forget that and say, well, if you can somehow manage the first three, but really those are equally important. For example, our water agencies, if you look at the way our water supply boards are constituted, they really are parastatal with no downward accountability, very limited transparency. They're already taking Japanese loans and investing hundreds of crores of rupees in setting up new sewage treatment plants, where actually the existing sewage treatment plants operate at 50% capacity. So, but nobody's asking these questions about why these investments are going in these particular directions. The pollution control boards are equally unaccountable downwards. They have 9 bureaucrats and 2 non-governmental nominees, all appointed by the state government, but nobody really knows through whom these governmental or non-governmental nominees are actually accountable. So we really have serious shortages of democratic governance in our society. And then you could add, and I put that purposely in gray, resilience to climate change as an additional goal. But we already have these other goals that we need to keep on the table when we talk about any kind of policies. And because these policies are all interlinked, we cannot be talking about a resilience policy which is separate from the problem of governance, sustainability, or equity, and so on. And that the reason why the resilience policy is interconnected with the achievement of the other goals is because you need to understand why we are far away from these goals. And the moment, of course, you introduce these multiple goals, you realize that climate is not going to be the sole explanation for why we are far away from these goals, but it might even not be the explanation for what seems like a climatically challenged sector. So I'm going to use again the example of the Eucalyptus river. So we looked at the declining flow in the Eucalyptus river, and we said there could be 5 possible reasons after discussing with experts, with bureaucrats, with farmers, and so on. 5 main reasons why the Eucalyptus might be drying, 2 of which are climatic. So rainfall declining, or rainfall intensities that are declining, so the water is kind of not really running off. It's or there's not enough water falling in the form of rain. And secondly, temperature increases, leading to increases in potential evapotranspiration, and therefore you just have losses because of that. And 3 non-climatic factors. One which is very popular with the policymakers, which is that the stream is blocked upstream at various points due to encroachments and so on, and some of the waters in these million puddles which are then evaporating all the water. Eucalyptus plantations that have increased over the last 30 years, leading to increased evapotranspiration, or pumping in irrigated agriculture, which is leading to evapotranspiration, which nobody talked about except from what we observed on the ground. So we thought, okay, there are these 5 hypotheses, 5 possible reasons why the Eucalyptus is drying up. When you look at the the annual rainfall record, there is no trend in rainfall patterns over the last 60 or even 100 years. So that's clearly not explaining any decline in the river. There's also no significant trend in the intensity. In fact, the intensities are increasing, if at all anything. So you should have seen more surface flow in the river. There's a marginal trend in the minimum temperature over time, but it does not actually, when you translate that into potential evapotranspiration, does not explain any of the decline in the flow of the river. The third popular explanation, which is the blockages, actually turns out then that the biggest blockages are newly constructed check dams by the government itself. So it's governmental, you can say, local resilience increasing policies, responding to declining groundwater levels by building more check dams, which are actually blocking water and not allowing the water to flow downstream into the reservoir. But the check dams themselves cannot really explain the flow decline because they're only repartitioning the water from surface to ground. Eventually, that water that went inside should have emerged somewhere else as base flow. But what is actually happening is that the check dams are next to bore wells, and the bore wells continue to pump, and then they go and add water to irrigated agriculture and evapotranspiration. If the check dams are themselves doing evaporation, again, that does not explain more than 10% of the decline that we have seen in the Eucalyptus river. This is part of a published paper in the Hydrology and Earth Sciences journal. The fourth hypothesis, which is about eucalyptus, yes, there is a huge increase in eucalyptus in this particular catchment from roughly 0 to 270 square kilometers, which is now 20% of the catchment area over the last 30 years or so. So that's clearly contributing to the decline. Again, it depends a lot upon the hydrology of the eucalyptus. The fact that now groundwater levels have gone up to 600 feet doesn't then help us, explain everything through eucalyptus because the roots are not going down to 600 feet. So some of the decline is explained by eucalyptus, maybe about 30% or 40%. And finally, the groundwater pumping for agriculture itself, which is corroborated by the declining water levels, is corroborated by the increased area of irrigation from 1991 to 2001. In a 10-year period, it doubled. Then it actually dropped, which is indicating that people are running out of those 53% failed bore wells. But you still see a change in the intensity. So the intensity of water use because of this change in cropping pattern, a shift from cereals to high-value horticultural crops, which are basically then sucking up more water. As you can see, the pink or this large portion here, which was cereals, now shrunk, and what we have is plantation, which is coconut, and then you've got cash crops. These are the 2 main guzzlers of water in the catchment in 2011. So that's the story of the causes of, for example, surface water flow decline, which is really that it's not explained by rainfall changes, it's not explained by temperature changes, it's not explained by the popular perception about blockages and encroachments, really explained by guzzling water for either irrigated crops or for eucalyptus. And so, sort of to give look at that larger picture, you're looking at proximate causes of stress in the water sector, which is really borewell pumping, eucalyptus, in the water quality context, missing sewerage systems, pipelines to actually underground sewers to bring sewage to the STPs rather than the missing STP itself, malfunctioning STPs, poor regulation of industrial water pollution, and the lack of purchasing power in the slums. Therefore, they cannot take metered water from BWSSB, and instead they have to then depend upon very limited supplies of other kinds. And that's the important thing to remember, that the causes of stress in the water sector are all these factors. In the current context, climate is not playing a major role. It does not mean that climate will not further aggravate these existing causes, but we are already highly aggravated in the sense of where we are in the water sector. I want to add this point about the role of infrastructure and institutions before I conclude, which is that if you look at how this impact plays itself out, even if there was a climate-induced impact on the availability of water, it's not going to be felt directly. The rainfed farming is one sector or one activity where the farmer feels the impact in terms of changed climatic patterns or increased variability. But again, remember, the rainfed farming in the South Asian context has evolved in a context of uncertain climate. It's always been climate variability, and rainfed farming has evolved in multiple strategies to adapt to climate variability. So one will have to factor in what technologies they already use to adapt, and then what additional stress will this new climate variability put on this already fairly adaptive technology in some sense. But in parallel, what we've been doing is the traditional development model is about increasing buffering against seasonality. That buffering happens through various technologies: open wells, irrigation tanks, reservoirs and diversions, and now bore wells and other storage facilities. So the whole story of development, even in the water sector or in agricultural sort of water connection, is about buffering ourselves against day-to-day, week-to-week, season-to-season variability by building storage and transmission technologies of various kinds. So you just over time build different ways of doing that. So we are not really going to feel the change in rainfall directly coming out as change in tap water in your house. That's not going to happen. You've got a whole set of infrastructure and institutions in between that mediates that effect. And it's not just the physical infrastructure. The physical infrastructure is accompanied by policies, agencies, and their ways of operating, which tells who gets that tap water, who doesn't get that tap water. So a lot of the distributional aspects, the pockets of scarcity amidst plenty, have nothing to do with either climate change or even with absolute scarcity of water. It has to do with the policies of that agency that is distributing water, who gets the water and who does not get that water. So we have a huge amount of infrastructure already in place. I mean, take the example of Bangalore city. We've gone from 135 million liters per day in 1974 to 900 million liters per day in 2006, 1410 in 2014. And we are doing this by pumping water 300 meters uphill and 87 kilometers distance. Bangalore is, by the way, the biggest energy consumer in terms of the supply of water to its residents in the whole of the country. And we've also got individual responses. While the government is setting up this infrastructure, you've got more than 1 lakh bore wells in Bangalore being used by people for augmenting or replacing or providing supply in the absence of city supply. And you've got already 14 sewage treatment plants being expanded to 28 using Japanese money, as I said. So conventional adaptation means building more infrastructure. It means one more pipeline from the Kaveri, which has already been planned. They want to go back to the tribunal for an exemption. Draw water from other rivers even further away. The current favorite is Yatinode diversion. 12,000 crores already sanctioned for a 200-kilometer pipeline or transfer of water from the Western Ghats to the Bangalore region. Borrow from the future, of course, then you are actually also putting that cost on the future rather than the present. You're increasing energy use in this whole process of transferring the water and in purifying that water. So the short-term adaptation. So what has happened now, the word adaptation has replaced the word problem solving. So the problem is a water scarcity. You say Yatinode diversion from 200 kilometers away. Now we just change that word from saying this is an adaptation. Adaptation to water scarcity is the Yatinode project. So you start blurring the line between climate adaptation and every other problem solving by calling everything as adaptation. So the adaptation is really about building more infrastructure at the cost of long-term sustainability, justice to communities elsewhere whose water you're taking away. And it's not exactly clear what it is doing to resilience, mind you. If you go by the narrow definition of resilience and the ability to bounce back, it's not at all clear what it is doing to resilience. It might be that actually you increase resilience. You have one supply from the Kaveri, one from the Yatinode, one from somewhere else, one from groundwater. So you're actually increasing your resilience because you've diversified your supply, but you're still facing a fair amount of scarcity in many parts of the city. So we need to look at some of the deeper causes which have to do with population growth, which have to do with consumption shifts. And mind you, the population growth, a lot of it in the city context is immigration and not just natural growth. Consumption shifts with income to more water intensive crops. Industrialization, of course, we've been talking about that in the mitigation context also, that we might be industrializing more, in which case we'll have more of these water pollution problems. And the associated governance failures. I think we have to look very, very critically at our governance systems that allow these to translate into pockets of scarcity, into long-term unsustainability, and into huge water pollution problems. So, just to summarize this final slide, it's not to deny future climate change. This is obviously a place where I can dare to open my mouth and say there is no climate change. But in case you got the story wrong, it's not about the absence of climate change. Sorry?
You can if you want.
Right. But this is, in case you got the story wrong, it's not about the absence of climate change or even the impacts of climate change on precipitation and temperature and therefore possibly on the water system. But to see that this needs to be analyzed in an additive manner. We need to understand these impacts will add to already existing failures, declines, pollution in these kinds of sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it is water, or any of the other sectors, even talking about urban flooding, etc. It's really an additive impact over and above what we are already facing in many ways, and that we also need a deeper analysis. We can't run simple models which take downscale some RCM, look at some number, and then say flooding will increase 20%, therefore number of people affected increases 20% or whatever, because it is again much more of the linkage between the physical phenomenon to the social outcome through infrastructure and also institutions. Not just infrastructure, the infrastructure and how it is run by societal systems. And that's really the message here, that we need adaptive analysis rather than saying assuming everything else stays the same. I mean, the favorite of many modelers is to say we just set risk variables, everything else is kept the same, and we only tweak the precipitation number a little bit high or low, or intensity is high or low, and see what happens. But that's really not staying the same. Nothing is really staying the same. Population growth is happening, urbanization is happening, industrialization is happening, and we better wake up and come up with ways of integrating that into the analysis rather than say, I just assume that everything else stays the same. And just to give you an example, the rate at which Bangalore's population is growing is already outstripped our 1400 MLD from the Kaveri, and it will continue to do so. So now people are arguing that wastewater recycling and reuse is really the only way we can bridge that gap. Now the question about wastewater recycling and reuse, again the same. Does it increase resilience? Now my friends in the resilience sector say no, not really, because the same Kaveri basin is supplying water which you will then recycle and use once again. So your dependence on Kaveri water is increased, not decreased. Now you have a drought in the Kaveri basin, you're going to have more problems in Bangalore rather than if you got water from the Yatinode reservoir. So you really have, I think, trade-offs between the resilience in a strict sense and other kinds of environmental goals and social goals about equity, justice, whose water are you tapping, and so on. But also remember that you will not really be able to deal with these issues. I'm saying deal with the issue of resilience or deal with the issue of equity or sustainability in the water sector unless you have some governance mechanisms. For example, the Kaveri Tribunal. For the first time, the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board said, we have a problem, is when the Kaveri Tribunal said, no more water to Bangalore. You reached your cap. Few years later, the discourse is back, has sort of slipped back into saying, we'll go to the tribunal and get an exemption for the next Kaveri stage 5. So, if our institutions are going to function in this kind of slip back mode, we're never really going to address any of these questions, whether it is resilience, sustainability, or equity. That's really my